Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Rules of the Game, Jutland and British Naval Command, by Andrew Gorton. Foreword by Sir John Woodward. Narrated by Nigel Patterson. Publisher's Note: this audiobook refers to figures, diagrams, maps and tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Foreword by Admiral Sir John Woodward. This book has prompted me to think about several fairly fundamental things concerning preparedness for war. Andrew Gorton's ostensible purpose is with command and control aspects of the Battle of Jutland, and these he analyses in considerable detail. I can claim no expertise on the First World War, but I can say that his account seems to me convincing from the professional viewpoint, and feels right in service cultural terms. However, the book's main import is the way Gorton demonstrates that to understand the command and control dynamics of Jutland, we have to dig quite a long way back into the Navy's peacetime past. The keynote of battle doctrine in Victorian times stemmed from the imperative to try to regulate everything, even the nature of combat, which of course cannot be done. Gorton persuasively argues that a defining moment for the Royal Navy's battleworthiness was the curtailment, after a disastrous collision in 1893, of the one really promising attempt to return the fleet's tactical doctrine to Nelsonic fundamentals. The result was that the Navy had to rediscover, from the bitter experiences of 1914 to 16, much about warfare which it should never have forgotten in the first place. The issues of eternal relevance to the fighting services, mentioned on the flyleaf, concern not just the realism of the peacetime training of future senior officers, but also the process of selecting those officers, of achieving the necessary balance between, as Gorton puts it, regulators and rat-catchers, which any fighting service needs. Each group tends to promote its own. Continuous war will produce a predominance of rat-catchers, as classically demonstrated by the Navy of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Continuous peace will produce a predominance of regulators, as evidenced by the pre-1914 Navy. In setting about the writing of my own book a few years ago, Patrick Robinson, who did all the hard work, quite early on remarked, "I thought admirals sort of fell out of trees. I am just beginning to realize there is a process which serves them up." This book tells us a great deal about the failings of that process in the long Victorian peace, and points out the dangers of allowing ourselves to be overtaken by similar failings today. It is difficult, but not necessarily impossible, in peacetime, when the stresses and unpredictabilities of war are hard to imagine and still harder to simulate, to identify those who would be good at it. The Victorian and Edwardian naval establishment did not recognize the need. We must do so, however problematical the task of identification. The real danger occurs when peace changes to war because the consequences of having people in, for them, the wrong jobs can be serious. Our strategic dominance enabled us to win the First World War at sea, in spite of having got it substantially wrong at the outset, but that dominance was surely historically unique. And anyway, the human, military and political costs of getting the thing wrong, and learning again from fresh experience, would be unacceptable in the modern world, as well as avoidable, if we can learn from history. History, Andrew Gorton maintains, offers us not so much lessons, but rather approximate precedents. The story he unravels of the pre-1914 Navy represents, in my view, an approximate precedent which today's service, and indeed any service in peacetime, should consider carefully. In 1982, most of the characters depicted in this book were still discernible in the Royal Navy, and all had roles to play. For the future, the vital thing is to have them in the right places at the critical time, that is, at the beginning of a conflict. A great deal easier said than done. Sandy Woodward. Introduction. In the late afternoon of the 31st of May 1916, fishermen and villagers on the sandy west coast of Denmark, and even farmers 30 miles inland, stopped their daily work and turned their heads towards the sea as they heard the rumble of distant gunfire. At first, perhaps, it could have been summer thunder. It went on intermittently for most of the evening, and broke out again for a while in the darkest hours of the night. For the Danes, as neutral, the war had so far meant shortages and rationing and the black market. They had little love for Germany, having lost the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein to Bismarck in the brief war of 1864, but they had less wish to get involved in the holocaust of violence which had gripped the continent now for nearly 2 years, and so far they had been spared sight and sound of battle. But there was no mistaking this. During the night the westerly breeze brought the faint pungent scent of cordite to those still watching and waiting and wondering in the Jutland peninsula. Their ancestors might have imagined Norse sea gods locked in titanic combat. The truth was scarcely less awesome. 70 miles out to sea, 250 warships of the 2 most powerful fleets in the world were engaged in a fight which might have reshaped the political map of Europe and the world beyond forever. 25 ships went to the bottom, and 9,000 men died. In a day or two the wreckage and the bodies started coming ashore, and continued to do so for more than a year. The dead were carefully interred in small, neat cemeteries and remote parish churchyards up and down the coast. A few items of flotsam, the odd brass fitting dragged up over the years in fishermen's nets, ended up as curios on mantelpieces or in local museums. Whether the Battle of Jutland was really a battle, or just the mother and father of skirmishes, depends on whose gun turret you peer out of. The German Hochseeflotte, High Seas Fleet, blundered into the stronger British Grand Fleet, while chasing what was assumed to be an isolated part of that fleet. The Germans had always dreaded a full-scale fleet encounter, and, faced now with this nightmare prospect, Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer turned his battle line around with great skill and under a hail of shellfire, and melted into the dusk, leaving the Royal Navy by default the uncontested masters of the North Sea. His 22 battleships failed to score any gunnery hits at all on Admiral Sir John Jellicoe's main battle line, and thus, in purely battle fleet terms, Jutland was one of the cheapest strategical victories in history. Yet for the British the encounter was a heartbreaking disappointment and a source of prolonged acrimony. It was, as Jellicoe said, unpalatable, because while the Germans escaped wholesale destruction, the British battle-cruisers, the advanced force of the Grand Fleet, under Vice-Admiral Sir David Beatty, suffered losses out of all proportion to any subsequent gain in the process of decoying Scheer into Jellicoe's trap. It was to be of little consolation that Jutland persuaded Germany's naval leaders that such an encounter must never be risked again, and assisted their conversion to unrestricted U-boat warfare. If the main fleet engagement had proceeded as morale and mathematics had promised, even the loss of 3 battle-cruisers and their 3,300 men would have appeared justifiable in the grim profit and loss columns of sacrifice. Beatty's achievement in drawing the High Seas Fleet into the killing ground in front of Jellicoe's 240 heavy guns, in spite of devastating setbacks, was a tribute to his leadership, single-mindedness, and stamina. But to have the enemy escape at the last moment, like Houdini, was, in Beatty's own words, gall and wormwood. It might be thought that Jutland has already been well enough raked over, and furthermore, it is too easy to criticize leaders when sitting in comfort with all the facts available and explanatory diagrams at hand for reference. One is apt to forget the real conditions which existed at the time, when all that could be seen were the dim outlines of a few ships vanishing before it was possible to distinguish friend or foe. However, all the facts are by no means available, many of the diagrams are far from explanatory, and Beatty's problems cannot all be attributed to the bad visibility or even to the Germans. and while the tactical management of the 4 fast battleships of the 5th Battle Squadron, 5th BS, temporarily attached to the Battle Cruiser Fleet, BCF, has attracted criticism from many historians, usually to air their opinions in the post-war Beatty versus Jellicoe controversy, the interaction between the BCF and the 5th BS, and between their respective leaders, Beatty and Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas, has never been considered in depth. Their failures to act in unison may be said to represent the fault line between 2 incompatible styles of tactical leadership. This book started by accident, in argument with a retired naval officer. I had no primary source knowledge of events, and would probably have stood from under had I foreseen the consequences. But I suggested that, on meeting the German battle fleet, the 5th BS should either have reversed course sooner than it did, or it should have turned away together, that is, simultaneously, rather than in succession, which took 3 vital minutes longer for the last ship. There was nothing original in this. I got it either from Donald MacIntyre's Jutland or from Geoffrey Bennett's The Battle of Jutland, and it seemed an unlikely bone of contention, but I was surprised by the response. I was told that I should watch out, or Beatty's ghost would rise up and strike me dead. The book took up much of my spare time for the next 7 years. At first my task appeared obvious and narrow, a navigational analysis of the relative movements of British capital ships in the battle cruiser phase of Jutland. But 2 seemingly incidental aspects of this subject, the personalities of the admirals involved, and the BCF's and Grand Fleet's respective battle orders, hinted at fundamentally different attitudes towards authority, and led me into the much larger fields of the leadership mores of the late Victorian Navy and of the early career conditioning of the future admirals of the Grand Fleet, particularly of Evan Thomas, who may be taken as broadly representative of the Jellicoe group, and of whom, unlike Beatty, comparatively little has hitherto been known. The result of this historically backwards linkage is the juxtaposition of the 2 disciplines, operational and cultural, of this book. Each could be the subject of study on its own, but the value of the whole is, I believe, more than the sum of the separate parts, and the strength of the link will, I hope, become apparent. For the 3rd strand of the tale, the coloured threads of personal experience, no explanation is necessary. While I hope to make coherent sense of the Battle of Jutland as a whole, my purpose is to focus on certain aspects which may have bearing on the issues of fleet command and control, and to concentrate on the exploits of certain capital ship squadrons, and upon episodes which remain in dispute, or where I myself dispute the accepted view. In the latter case, it is not sufficient merely to present a counter-received narrative without explanation. If I did so, I would run the gauntlet of conventionally informed listeners unaware of the reasons for my assertions. Thus, it is necessary to indicate what the accepted view is, and what is wrong with it. This occasional descent into abstrusions, how many admirals can dance on the head of a belaying pin, may bemuse listeners who want to know about battles between ships, rather than post-mortem rows between senior officers and squabbles between historians. But as the historiographical arguments about Jutland stem, more often than not, from the conflict of style and conflict of conceits among the major players, they could be said to form an integral part of the tale. Part 1. Background to Battle. 1. A ship which can do everything. The battle cruiser should be superseded by the fast battleship. The 29,000-ton battleship commissioned into the Royal Navy on August 19, 1915, in Clydebank, was named after an admiral with no major sea battles to his credit. Charles Middleton's part in Britannia's ascendancy was more fundamental. Controller of the Navy from 1778 to 1790, and First Lord of the Admiralty at the time of Trafalgar, Lord Barham, as he became in 1805, equalled Samuel Pepys as one of the most efficient naval administrators Britain has ever had. and supplied to the fighting admirals the incomparable military machine which carried the Royal Navy through the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Captain Arthur Craig, a very efficient gunnery type, gave an elegant speech in which he informed his crew that their new ship's name was pronounced Barham as in barrel, and not Barham with a long first A. This, he said, was in accordance with the usage of Barham's descendants, of whom the Earl of Gainsborough was head, or was it from the village of Barham in Kent, one or the other? Anyway, anyone overheard referring to HMS Barham would have his leave stopped. A senior officer's little joke. After the formalities, the guests and dignitaries went on a tour of the ship. This involved admiring the 8 enormous guns, and clambering up and down companionways in slow time, the ladies nervously clutching their skirts. Eventually, in the wardroom lobby, they came to the lift, which connected the upper deck with the central engine room. It was novel for a ship to have an elevator, and some of the visitors professed an interest in the geared turbines which gave Barham her vaunted 25 knots. This had been anticipated. The executive officer, second in command, Commander Henry Brownrigg, courteously ushered them into the lift, closed the cage door, and pressed the button. They descended 5 feet and stuck. Electricians were sent for at the rush, while the commander, clutching his sword, lay down on the quarter-scene and made polite small talk with the explorers, whose heads were now just above deck level. The midshipmen present savoured the scene for reenactment in the gun-room later, and dared not look each other in the eye. That, at least, is how Rear Admiral Royer Dick, midshipman 1914-16, remembered the commissioning of the third of 5 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, the one destined to be flagship of the class at Jutland. In retrospect, Queen Elizabeth, Warspite, Barham, Valiant, and Malaya seem even more of a milestone than can have been apparent when they first joined the fleet. For several years they were the largest, fastest, and most powerful battleships in the world. They did sterling service in both world wars, and Warspite became the most battle-honoured capital ship of all time. But even in 1915, when the Navy had grown accustomed to a heady succession of bigger and better dreadnoughts taking to the water, it was obvious that these were more than just the usual incremental improvement on their predecessors, and Winston Churchill, the young First Lord of the Admiralty at the time of their conception, claims much and deserves some of the credit for them. They were the first dreadnoughts to carry 15-inch caliber guns, whose shells weighed 1,920 pounds, as against the 1,400 pounds of the 13.5-inch projectile, or 850 of the 12-inch. Moreover, they were designed around these guns, and their orders placed with the shipyards before any such weapons existed. Not until hurried prototype guns had been built and tested, while the ships were growing on the stocks, did Churchill know his time-saving gamble had paid off. The 15-inch breech-loading rifle, 2 specimens of which are impressively mounted in front of the Imperial War Museum, was a huge success. The Queen Elizabeth's guns, and their layout in tiered twin turrets fore and aft, were to influence the 5 Royal Sovereigns, Germany's Bayern class, Renown and Repulse, Hood and Vanguard, and even Bismarck and Tirpitz. They were the first capital ships to be oil-fired, an innovation which ended the scurrying, miserable, back-broken, black-faced nightmare of coaling ship, and brought great benefits in efficiency, endurance, and cleanliness. But here was another gamble, for whereas South Wales was made of coal, Britain had no indigenous sources of oil, and an oil-fired fleet might be cut off from overseas fuel supplies in time of war. That risk, with all its political and military implications, was lightly shouldered, and Churchill extracted £2.2 million from Parliament to buy a controlling interest in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, a transaction second only to Disraeli's purchase of the Suez Canal shares in strategic ramifications for Britain and the Middle East. They had a top speed which, although not as high as intended, more on this later, was unprecedented for battleships, and earned them a place in the Royal Navy's front line for 30 years. These revolutionary attributes were expressed in a balanced and reassuringly familiar silhouette, a sublime version of the classic King Edward VII class of pre-dreadnoughts of 1902. Looking back over the tale of our capital ships, we can see at long intervals a few which stand out by virtue of their fine appearance and exceptional military qualities. To them the Queen Elizabeth must be added, and given pride of place as the most perfect example of the naval constructor's art as yet put afloat. To understand these ships' significance, and the proprietorial rivalry which they aroused, we have to consider the composition and organization of the fleet in 1915. The modern capital ships of the British Navy were divided into two distinct dreadnought types, with distinct design characteristics and distinct military functions, the battleship and the battle cruiser. The latter's origins were doctrinally precarious. Both types were products of Admiral Sir John Jacky Fisher's epoch-making design revolution of 1906 to 1908, but apart from sharing the common features of heavy guns, turbine propulsion, and sheer size, they should not be confused and were by no means interchangeable. At the turn of the century, the standard battleship was a 15,000-ton armoured platform for 4 12-inch and various lesser guns, propelled at around 18 knots by triple expansion engines. Its future was in doubt. Effective battle ranges were about 2,000 yards, at which short distance even the thickest practicable armour belt could be perforated by heavy shells fired by the new rifled breech-loaders and striking at near muzzle velocities. Heavy armour would be mere deadweight burden. All future capital ships, it seemed, would be eggshells armed with hammers, to borrow a later description of battle cruisers, whether they had armour or not. Jacky Fisher had long been obsessed with the concept of a very fast, heavily gunned capital ship, perhaps as a legacy of his service in the 1860s, as a young gunnery lieutenant in Britain's first ironclad, HMS Warrior, now preserved in Portsmouth. With armour now of doubtful utility, Fisher became a passionate advocate of a new type of ship, which need not be burdened with thousands of tons of armour, but which would have great speed to dictate the terms of combat, and great firepower to overwhelm any opponent quickly. More specifically, it would be able to deal with the new French armoured cruisers, which were posing a potential threat to British trade routes. When Fisher succeeded to the post of First Sea Lord in 1904, the time looked right for his fast supercruiser to usurp the battleship. But technology advances on a broad front, albeit erratically, and the pendulum had to some extent swung back. The coming of age of the torpedo made it necessary for large warships to exploit the long-range potential of their heavy guns in order to engage beyond the reach of the enemy's flotilla craft, and through improvements in range-finders and the drive of gunnery reformers such as Percy Scott, Lord Charles Beresford, and Fisher himself with his fish-pond of disciples, a succession of technical problems were surmounted, and battle ranges suddenly stretched out to 8,000 yards, ranges at which large shells, impacting now at oblique angles of descent and with velocities partially spent, could be defeated by hardened armour plate. The armoured capital ship was back in business, and the new idea that a ship's guns should all be controlled by one centrally placed observer, who would watch their shell splashes and coordinate corrections in elevation and bearing, favoured a single-calibre armament. Fisher was still loath to be diverted from his supercruiser concept, but bowed to the battleship lobby, and authorised the famous dreadnought in 1905. By any standards other than Fisher's, the 17,500-ton dreadnought was a bold enough leap in design. As well as having 10 guns of 12-inch calibre, she was big enough to carry reasonable armour protection against her own size of main armament, a rough-and-ready rule of thumb for a balanced warship design. And her turbine-driven 21 knots were a critical tactical advantage over the 18 knots of existing battleships. Turbines were a great improvement on reciprocating machinery, for while pistons waste their momentum and start again at the end of each stroke, at the cost of much vibration and wear, turbines keep spinning in a constant direction with enhanced efficiency and service life. No ship of such size had yet been given turbines, and Fisher's commitment of Dreadnought to this power source was as great a gamble as the guns of the Queen Elizabeth class 7 years later, and as great a success. Radical as Dreadnought appeared to be, to her putative sponsor she remained a compromise. Fisher still wanted his high-speed Predator, arguing a role in imperial defence. The first battle cruisers, Invincible, Indomitable and Inflexible, were completed in 1908 to 1909. Because they were intended never to encounter accurate heavy shell fire, much of the tonnage taken up by armour in a battleship could be made available for extra propulsive machinery, and so they were able to combine the firepower of the Dreadnought battleship with the 25 knots of the light cruiser. Then a civilian inventor, Mr. Arthur Pollen, entered the debate in a roundabout way, with a design for a gunnery fire control system which promised extraordinary accuracy at extreme ranges. Pollen had, by chance, become fascinated with the problems of prediction inherent in naval gunnery at long ranges, and had thought the matter through with a professionalism unapproached by naval officers. He perceived the stumbling block to be the rate of change of range, itself an ever-changing average of the movements of both the firing ship and the target. And while naval officers were still struggling with trigonometry, Pollen devised an analog computer which could produce constantly updated solutions using differential calculus. Like any computer, a fire control predictor is hostage to the accuracy of the input data, and until the invention of radar, this depended on optical rangefinders, their operators, and the men spotting and correcting the fall of shot. But Pollen's inventions at least made optimum use of the obtainable range data, and for testimonial purposes, it is sufficient to say that the 16-inch guns of the U.S. Navy's Iowa-class battleships still depend, in the last decade of the 20th century, on derivatives of the system offered to the Admiralty by Pollen in the first. How profoundly Fisher understood Pollen's system is uncertain, but he grasped its potential sufficiently to see that a fast ship so equipped, conceptualized by him as HMS Unapproachable, would have an extreme range killing zone which even enemy battleships would be unable to cross to reach their own effective ranges. Unapproachable's speed would enable her to dictate the range and enjoy relative immunity, while her superior gunnery did the business. Here was a rationale for not buying back into the protection offered once more by heavy armour plate. But what of Arthur Pollen's fire control computer? The dismal story of how a gunnery officer, Captain Frederick Dreyer, peddling his own inferior but attractively cheaper trigonometrical system, was allowed to nobble the trials and acquisition processes, and how in consequence the Admiralty failed to make use of Pollen's brilliant work until after the 1914-18 war, has been exhaustively told by the inventor's son, Anthony Pollen, and by Professor John Sumida. The consequence, simply put, was that while the British made early and energetic progress along the path towards the automation of target prediction, setting out on this necessary journey was a different thing from arrival, and British fire control at the time of Jutland fell between two stools. In taking observed and estimated data, and adding both manual delays and mechanical errors, Dreyer's system deprived the guns of the responsiveness of direct observation, and yet failed to produce accurate results in conditions of fast-changing rates of change of range and bearing. Some gunnery officers at Jutland would find themselves cutting it out of the loop altogether in sheer frustration, and dealing directly with the turrets. Fisher, a simple and guileful man, did not disseminate the mental acrobatics behind his cherished battlecruisers. Few officers had access to the jealously obfuscated fire control debate, and fewer properly understood it. And while some senior commanders afloat were slightly puzzled about what these ships were for, and found themselves defining operational roles more or less on the hoof, their bold simplicity found many admirers. It was obvious, for example, that an Invincible could catch and overpower any conventional armoured cruiser, as she was to demonstrate at the battles of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?